begin by acknowledging Congressman Scott Peters, who is with us. And because of scheduling, I'd like to do two things up front with Congressman Peters. First is to introduce him and thank him for the work that he's done on behalf of rare disease patients, rare disease access. Congressman Peters has been a very important voice in this Congress, as well as in previous Congresses, attuned to those issues. So we will be presenting Congressman Peters with a Rare Access Award this year as a federal policymaker who has made an impact on patient access. But first, let me introduce Congressman Peters, and then we'll turn some time over to him. Congressman Peters serves California's 52nd Congressional District, which includes Coronado, Poway, and most of northern San Diego. He was first elected in 2012, and he currently serves on the House Budget Committee and the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the Joint Economic Committee. Congressman Peters is a civic leader who has made improving the quality of life in San Diego his life's work. As a member of Congress, Congressman Peters' emphasis has been promoting and expanding San Diego's innovation ecosystem, and many of us can relate to that. We're familiar both with the companies and with the organizations that have come out of this very important life sciences corridor, and advocating for San Diego's pivotal role as a partner in the national defense and making government work again. Interestingly enough, Congressman Peters is ranked 4th most independent Democrat in Congress by the National Journal. And he understands that business problems have bipartisan solutions, and is never afraid to work across party lines to build consensus and get things done. With that, I'd like to turn the time over to Congressman Peters as well as thank him. And we will be sending to his office his Rare Access Leadership Award for 2021. Thank you. Congressman Peters.
Thanks, Mike, and really appreciate the, not everyone says thank you in this job. So it's very nice to get a pat on the back from your group, and I appreciate that very much. Just a little bit about San Diego, for those of you who I'm sure you probably know, but in the course of dealing with drug pricing over the last few months, we did look at how important this is to our economy, and we found that there's 68,000 jobs in life sciences, probably 174,000 that are indirectly related to life sciences in our county, and almost 1,000 companies doing this work. And so we're proud of the big employers we have, like Eli Lilly or Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer, but obviously most of those companies are small operations backed by private risk capital, trying to solve really hard science problems, and a lot of them are having to do with rare diseases. So when the idea of dealing with drug pricing came up last term, I knew that in the way that the Senate was configured, it wouldn't ever happen. And I expressed some concerns about what would be the effect on innovation if you took away you didn't change the risk profile, but you changed the return at the end of the day. The same proposal got proposed this year, and so I had to take some hard no votes with the help of some of my colleagues to say, hold on, we can get to a place where we're providing relief for seniors who are on Medicare at the pharmacy without destroying those incentives. So we have, I think, come up with something that will still provide a good runway for all those private investors to continue to take bets on these really hard to deal with diseases that you're all confronting. We keep in mind that the development of these cures is a partnership of the private sector and the public sector. On the public side, no one's been a bigger advocate for increasing the budget for the National Institutes of Health, where the top scientists in the country compete in peer-reviewed grant system for money to do basic scientific research. A lot of that happens at places like the Salk Institute, Scripps Research, La Jolla Immunology, Sanford Burnham Previs, UCSD, all in San Diego, in and around my district. That's very important. But the government does not commercialize those products. That we leave that to the private sector, where at no risk to taxpayers, people take big bets. 95% failure rates, takes $1 billion to get something to market. And we want to preserve those incentives because it's a system that's produced a lot of wonderful innovations and cures. I'm also interested in, with respect to rare diseases, a bigger deployment of genomics for diagnostics. We found at Rady's Children's Hospital, the Baby Bear Project, that some early attention to some of these hard to diagnose diseases for kids can really help with cures and with this diagnostic odyssey, we call it, that people have to go through. And we want to make sure that when we think of innovation, that testing and diagnostics is a big thing up front. We have to have those cures. So it's been my pleasure to continue to work to make sure that we preserve these incentives while we provide relief at the counter for seniors. And I think we're at a pretty good place. I think everyone would like it to be a little bit better from their perspective. And it has been quite a journey to have pushed back on the herd. To say no to your party, it takes a little bit of doing. And particular thanks to my staff here for working the academics of this, but also my district staff for taking the angry phone calls for people who thought we were against drug price reform. I think we've shown that we can do both, and I appreciate the support of the Rare Access Action Project. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Peters. And, we'll try to be very respectful of your time, but we'll move on to the other panelists. And again, thank you. And we look forward to working with you as well. Our next panelist is Jennifer Snow. Jennifer is a Vice President of Reimbursement Policy and Insights at AmerisourceBergen's Xcenda. And she works with clients to keep them informed on the latest legislative and regulatory updates. Her team analyzes the healthcare environment and provides strategic guidance on how to best navigate challenges to patient coverage and access. Ms. Snow is a subject matter expert on the Affordable Care Act, quality measures, medication adherence, and federal health programs. And she holds an MPH from the University of North Carolina and a BS in Russian from Georgetown University. Our second panelist will be Jamie Sullivan, who works at the Every Life Foundation. And I have gotten to know Jamie over the past year, and I have to tell you, she is an absolute joy to work with as we work with our colleagues at the Every Life Foundation. Jamie has a background in health policy. She was the Vice President of Public Affairs at the COPD Foundation, as well as an advisory board panel member at Improving Healthcare Systems at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And so we look forward to hearing from both Jennifer and then Jamie, and then we'll turn the conversation open to questions and to have some discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. So earlier in today's agenda, Mike talked a little bit about Medicare Part D and the kind of where we're at with the current baseline of Part D and what the Build Back Better Act suggests, the direction of it. And I think there's a lot of good in there, but I think when it comes to rare disease, there are some cautions. And so what I wanted to do is take a few minutes to talk about where the Part D program is now, and then where it could go with Build Back Better and what it could mean for rare disease. So to start with the baseline, current law for 2024 would have beneficiaries pay a $530 deductible, and then beneficiaries would pay a 25% and through the coverage gap, and then they would hit a 5% during catastrophic. There is no out-of-pocket gap. And I think that there's large consensus that no out-of-pocket, no end to the out-of-pocket for beneficiaries is devastating, particularly for many of those suffering from rare conditions, where not only is it the cost of the pharmaceuticals, but it is also the cost of medical treatment. And without an end in sight, that is a lot of money, that 5% month over month, and then restarting the following year. So in this situation, in the current baseline, manufacturers do contribute. They contribute 70% of the cost for non-low income subsidy beneficiaries during that coverage gap. And that is about, I'm going to say about $4,000. It's a capped amount. It's a fixed amount that they're responsible for per beneficiary. Now, Build Back Better does offer in its current iteration, what it would do is it would have beneficiaries pay 23% instead of 25%, and that's the non-low income beneficiaries. Manufacturers would pay 10% in the initial coverage phase, and then once beneficiaries hit their out-of-pocket cap, which is at $2,000, beneficiaries would pay nothing, which is remarkable. A $2,000 out-of-pocket cap is, it will save millions of beneficiaries money every year. Then what the Build Back Better proposes is that during that out-of-pocket cap, during that catastrophic coverage, manufacturers would pick up 20%, the government would pick up 20%, and the plans would pick up 60%. Now, all of this is, I think, a step in the right direction, but when you look at it from a rare disease point of view, it certainly will change the dynamics for companies who are working in that rare disease orphan space. And what we did was we put together an issue brief for RAP, and we looked at 3 different conditions. We looked at an oncology drug, a pulmonary hypertension drug, and a primary biliary cholangitis drug. And we said, okay, what would happen in the current structure? And then what would the BBBA do for that same kind of product mix? And what you see is that for the most part, costs are going up a lot for manufacturers. For example, for that oncology product, there's less than 1,000 patients. So you're not talking about a huge, population, but instead of about $1.9 million that the liability would be for a manufacturer in the current baseline, that liability would go up to $10.7 million. And it goes up a lot more when it comes to the pulmonary hypertension drugs. You go from a $24 million liability under the current baseline to a $340 million liability. And so a big jump in liability. And I think when it comes to those kind of costs, and you're talking about less than 5,000 patients, that is a lot for a manufacturer to bear. Particularly, they don't necessarily have other drugs in their pipeline or drugs that they are currently have on market to offset that. If you have obviously a larger base, then that may not be as impactful, but that 20% manufacturer liability in the catastrophic, I think certainly will be painful for many manufacturers. On top of that, what there is also is the BBBA proposes an inflationary penalty. And for many manufacturers, and we modeled this out in the white papers or the issue brief as well, you're talking about, increasing, liability of, millions of dollars. It takes the pulmonary hypertension example from, a $24 million per year liability currently to $390 million per year. And so you can see that's a huge jump for any manufacturer. I think the Build Back Better is absolutely a step in the right direction in terms of putting a cap on the manufacturer, putting a cap on out-of-pocket spending for beneficiaries. But I do worry about what the impact could be for manufacturers who may not have the same breadth of drugs in their pipeline to cover it, or if they're primarily in the Medicare space, maybe not have a kind of a balance in that commercial space to balance these out. I will say the one great thing that's currently in the proposed legislation is that there is a carve out for orphan drugs in terms of the negotiated pricing. So the way the BBBA is now is it's proposing that one of the kind of things beyond the out-of-pocket cap, beyond the inflationary penalties, is that the Secretary of HHS would negotiate prices for certain Medicare drugs. And if it is an orphan drug, or if it's under $200 million worth of Medicare spending per year, it's exempt. So orphan drugs for now are exempt. And I think that's a great thing for rep and its constituents. And so for now, we're hoping that sticks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jamie, we'd like to turn the time over to you and look forward to your comments.
Sure. So I can just make a couple of comments on how EveryLife is approaching the drug pricing conversations, and what else we're really focused in on as it relates to the current reconciliation bill. I'm then happy to answer any questions. So we, back in May, finalized our drug pricing, rare disease community drug pricing statement. We did that in conjunction with our community Congress members, which are patient organizations and pharma industry, other rare disease stakeholders. And the goal behind pulling together that statement was to outline the unique considerations that face rare disease and that policymakers should be considering as they work on drug pricing legislation, and so that we can put information in the hands of other rare disease organizations as they seek to evaluate how they how the impact of any proposals around drug pricing might be for their communities, and what they want to support and not. So that statement is published on our website, and it involves everything from looking at statements like we need to balance similar things you've talked about here today, right? Already, we need to balance innovation with the real need and the real hurt that rare disease families are facing when it comes to getting access to medications, but also pointing out that for many with rare diseases, at least as it relates to their rare disease treatment, 93 to 95% of rare diseases have no treatment still. So, one of the things I wanted to bring up today, was part of that statement suggests that if we are going to undergo let's say policy experiments, which, when you have a radical change to how something is done, it could be in a way an experiment, right? That it shouldn't be done with rare disease patients, in the crosshairs first, before you can prove that something is not going to impact negatively that innovation and their ability to hopefully meet their unmet need, moving forward. So the statement contains ideas like that, as well as the focus on other ways that we could be, finding solutions to the very real problem of, drug pricing. But things like using alternative payment arrangements, and really getting the policy roadblocks out of the way, so that value-based agreements can be used in rare disease therapies appropriately, but then pivoting to the importance of making sure that those agreements are informed by patients, make sure that the right metrics are being incorporated into those agreements, and that a full toolbox is being used rather than one method or another, in particular, as it relates to things, the ongoing conversations around the role of cost effectiveness analysis and otherwise. So the statement really spans from the protecting, the innovation and the role of the FDA, through to the last section, which is where I think we're very excited to see, and that's we need to focus on policies that can lower the out-of-pocket costs to patients, and also reduce the barrier of time and those delays and the inappropriate use of utilization management in many cases in rare diseases. So I think it's clearly a balancing act, and we continue to engage, continue to evaluate what's the impact of the existing proposals will be, what are the possibilities around carve-outs and exemptions for rare diseases, so that we don't find out what the impact of these policies are on the backs of rare disease patients first, and that we can keep moving forward. But the other thing I just wanted to mention quickly, and I know it's not the topic of the discussion, but it's definitely related, is our main focus right now with reconciliation administration has been in really pushing to remove the provision around the orphan drug tax credit changes, because we feel absolutely those changes will be harmful to the rare disease community. The idea that the tax credit will be limited to just the first approval or indication is just contrary to, you know, where we think there's promise in rare diseases, and is really just taking a broad solution, you know, a broad brush to a narrow problem there. And we are working very hard to engage, to share examples from the community of real promise that is being shown based on that second investment, third investment, and why that's important to keep incentivizing. And not to mention the fact that the tax credit was just slashed recently. And I don't even think we've really had enough time to go by to see the impact of that change on you know, interest and investment in rare diseases. So that is one area that I know wasn't necessarily drug pricing policy, but is certainly relevant, and one of the ways that EveryLife is engaging in the reconciliation conversation.
Wow, so much to unpack. And I think that was a good tee up for the discussion, Jamie, thank you. I go back to something that Congressman Peters said about, you know, looking at the diversity in the rare disease landscape, everything from family foundations to emerging companies with maybe no products or one product, to larger global companies that invest in rare diseases. It's really important to look at that diversity across kind of the segment as you're designing policies. And I was struck by one thing that you said, Jamie, and I hadn't thought about it quite this way before, is that we're kind of experimenting with policy here to see what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, to implement something and then, you know, maybe 10 or 20 years from now say, oh, well, maybe that didn't work. And we've reduced the pipeline, we've reduced investments. Maybe we've transitioned investments from orals to injectables because of incentives in two different programs. So there's a lot of things that can have unintended consequences, I guess, in this space. So I was curious how when you had that discussion on balancing innovation and patient access, I think that sometimes there don't necessarily have to be these exact trade-offs, that the 21st century toolkit can give us some creativity to find savings and find other areas that we can kind of drive this forward. And so I'd be interested, Jamie and Jennifer, on your thoughts on you know, driving innovation into payment, and what does that mean?
Jennifer, you want to start? Or okay, well, I mean, I'll just share. I think I don't know if I have a good answer, but you know, I know we have inaction is not an answer. You know, inaction is not an option. We know from our rare disease organizations and Community Congress, we held a separate call with them as part of our access working group, that, you know, there are very real challenges that they're facing, and we have to address them. So inaction isn't an option, but at the same time, you know, we do have other tools, and we do have quite a need to study, do more, you know, collection of data, think about, you know, innovation and payment models before we take this broad brush to policy changes. And so again, you know, looking at things like innovative payment models, alternative payment arrangements, outcomes-based, you know, payment arrangements, you know, just building more on how you do a patient-driven value assessment is something that I think you know, EveryLife is working on, and we're very interested in. And you know, the typical model of value assessments aren't going to work for rare diseases. Just the methodology doesn't doesn't work for many rare diseases. So, there are things that we can do now. There are people out there innovating in how you bring treatments to the market, especially as it relates to things like N of 1 therapies and, just very ultra rare therapies. There's people like Jim Wilson and his shop that just started in rare, I can't remember the name exactly, but out of UPenn, where they're looking at different models to bring ultra rare therapies to the market. There are clear things we can do, and we should be pursuing those options while finding ways to make sure that patients that have options now get access to those therapies without the burdensome costs and time that they're facing now.
And from my perspective, I think, unfortunately, some of the policy changes will have to be, we're going to see them in terms of the Part D benefit. And for a lot of beneficiaries, it's great changes, the out-of-pocket cap, but I would love to see some carve outs for the ultra rare, drugs and orphan products, particularly when it comes to, certainly the inflationary penalty, but also the way that the Part D benefit will be structured. The Build Back Better Act is certainly, I think, a more favorable design than what we saw in HR 3 with the manufacturer at 20% catastrophic, but that's still a lot of money. That there's no way that could not impact innovation. And so when it comes looking at that, Congressman Peters had a 10%, manufacturer liability. Even that's a lot, but I think certainly more favorable. I would love to see just more exceptions be made for certain drugs, the way that they were thinking about it for, correct, maybe, whether it'd be possible for a rare disease indication to be carved out. I know indications are hard because of the data, but either way, can we think about a world of exceptions to the policy so that we don't necessarily, we don't stifle innovation in the space because, or squash even just the organizations that are currently existing to the point where they're forced to sell. And so I would love to see that kind of consideration being made as we look at these bills.
Mike, you're on mute. It's okay, it's got to happen at least once a day.
Jamie, I wanted to come back to you and talk a little bit about how EveryLife kind of communicates and wraps these research priorities into discussions like tax changes or Medicare Part D restructuring. Often it seems like everybody says, "Oh, I've heard that story." So when you talk about the orphan drug tax credit and the desire to kind of carve it and trim it and reshape it. Talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on weaving in those research priorities and how those policies could affect those areas.
Yeah, I mean, our job as a patient advocacy organization is to tell real examples from the patient community of how these policies can be harmful and who's being impacted now. So especially with the orphan drug tax credit, one of the first things we did was reach out into our community and say, we're looking for real examples of what is in the pipeline right now. What products brought innovation to your space that actually came as the second or third approval for that product, and why. Tell us that story. And those are the stories we've been communicating to the Hill. So one example that I think is really striking is in Prader-Willi syndrome. Prader-Willi syndrome doesn't have an approved treatment, and it is a similar, basically what happened is a treatment was approved for epilepsy, and the Prader-Willi community and both the organization and the scientific expertise in the Prader-Willi community saw that promise based on the way that treatment for narcolepsy, sorry, not epilepsy, narcolepsy was developed, in the target that it worked on in the brain and the hypothalamus, said we have a similar mechanism happening in Prader-Willi. I think there's reason to believe that this science, could show that this it's at least worth testing and bringing this product into clinical, development to see if it could help with some of the Prader-Willi symptoms. And I think that's just the perfect example to share with members on what type of science you might be disincentivizing and what type of hope you would be taking away from a community if that company, who may not otherwise have the capital to reinvest in additional clinical development programs otherwise, if it wasn't for the tax credit, or ability to attract new, venture capital. And we don't have to be experts on the financing side. We need to be experts on the patient side and say, come to the table with real people, real stories, and data to show how those changes might influence and negatively impact patients. So I think the Prader-Willi story, we've got a number of others where we have people that have products that are approved for their disease now, with evidence to, guide. I think the comment of, oh, well, couldn't they just use them off label if they were approved already? Well, that comes without evidence to guide your decision making that it works for you, for your condition. That comes with a host of payer problems and not being able to get access to the product. So, that's not a solution either. So yeah, that's the approach we take generally. And especially with this orphan drug tax credit, there are very clear examples of communities who have hope because of this tax credit.
Thanks, Jamie. It's very complicated, and I think some of that is lost in terms of appreciation by policy stakeholders, how complicated it is to really, once you dig into various ways that populations interact with the medication, with, the value of the medication, et cetera, that it needs a much more nuanced approach.
Absolutely.
Jennifer, turn to you for a second. Could you speak a little bit more about the rare disease carve out?
Sure.
From the discussion, it sounds like from a policy standpoint, everybody says, well, that's a really important protection for rare disease products. But in reality, it seems like the price negotiation protections for rare diseases might be kind of meaningless, since orphan products are unlikely to be affected anyways under the current structure in the Build Back Better plan. So could you just speak to that just for a moment?
So I do think it's a good thing it's there overall. So let me take a step back and say, what I spent the majority of my kind of time talking about was the two other components of the Build Back Better Act, in terms of the out-of-pocket cap and the manufacturer liability changes, as well as the inflationary penalty. The third component, which I didn't really talk a lot about, was the legislation also calls for manufacturer or for a Medicare negotiation of drug pricing. Right now, the way it's written, there is an exclusion for orphan drugs, and that's those approved under Section 526 of the Federal Food Drug and Cosmetic Act. Now, you're right in that there is the other exceptions on there are if drug spending is less than $200 million. Now, you're right. For a lot of orphan drugs, they're going to fall underneath that, though I also recognize that, there may be occasions, particularly as we look forward, that the spending will be above that. And so I think that the exclusion is a good one. And a starting point. And I also appreciate that it's there. I would also love to have seen an exception like that under other parts of the legislation for the manufacturer liability, in the out-of-pocket cap, as well as in the inflationary penalty.
Yeah, it just seems like there are some minefields in each of those pieces that could impact the pipeline moving forward. Many of you know that from my experience, I worked in a couple of emerging rare disease companies. And in particular, what struck me and I was thinking about, Jennifer, as you were speaking, was those companies that maybe have one product on the market, or two products. And they're looking at price increases in those programs that they can't make up for. And now we're looking at potentially a penalty for, raising faster than the CPI. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and how that might impact kind of those smaller companies and, what you see as maybe some solutions? Maybe there are some ways that we could look at this differently.
Sure. I mean, certainly the economics of being a small pharmaceutical company with one product, maybe in the pipeline, maybe two, or one product on the market, and you're sort of flying by the seat of your pants anyway, you're really trying to keep it all together. It's a very different than a large, multinational, global, pharmaceutical company that makes billions of dollars a year. Very different economics. You're purchasing, all of it from can you imagine, from your HR to your, your ability to purchase. It's just totally a different story. And I think when you're talking about your ability to leverage parts of your your current market portfolio, I mean, you don't have it as a one or two product shop. It's just completely the opposite. And I think particularly in the inflationary penalty piece, I think it's a very interesting dynamic for all companies, but particularly those with from smaller shops, in that commercial markets and actually Medicare markets as well, they all love that we work in a system of discounts and rebates, and so there's going to be a lot of pressure in order to continue to increase prices, because that's the way the whole system makes money. And so I think that pressure is not going to go away. And if you are a smaller company, you're going to have to kind of absorb that penalty as well. And that, in combination with the other pieces, the dynamics are just brutal. And so I would love to see, again, some exceptions be made. Maybe maybe those same exceptions that we talked about for the negotiation carry through to other, to the out-of-pocket cap, to the inflationary penalty. So that is not just in that one dynamic, but really across the board. Also, I'm sorry, my second thought there was, you also have to think about not just what's there today, but what's there in the future. And you have to make the investment worth it. It's going to be hard to find people willing to spend the money, willing to invest in these companies, willing to invest in these therapies, the potential of these therapies, if there's not going to be a return on investment, because these are very uncertain drugs. The payout may not be there, and so there has to kind of be some risk reward that you can anticipate.
I think that's an important thing to remember, and particularly in the rare disease community, is some of these products we're talking about are never going to be blockbusters. They're serving 200 patients or 300 patients or maybe 1,000 patients. And so, there's not even an argument for growth, because the growth is actually capped by incidence, and it's very small. And so there's a lot of challenges there. This question is for both of you, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the types of carve-outs that Jamie had talked a little bit about. Is it possible to implement a carve-out for rare indications versus rare disease products? And what are the challenges there, looking at each different solution?
My understanding about the indication, and my information could be wrong, was that part of it is just about the data in, data out, what we have access to in terms of the point of sale, and what the drug is being used for, and whether that information is being appropriately captured in order to be able to figure out that discount. Doesn't mean it can't be done. It can be done, but my understanding is that it's a data issue more than it's a logistics issue more than anything. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything to add to that.
Well, it's an interesting way to look at it, and of course the data issues are important, because of course you want consistency. You want to make sure you're capturing the right data and information if you're going to have to administer, let's say, an indication versus an entire product. I guess let me just, Jamie, I really wanted to hear some of your thoughts about the impact on innovation. And, you know, when we talk about a lot of the innovation that's going on in the rare community now, we're talking about, and from my experiences, we're talking about university research centers, talking about family foundations, talking about small companies that often go at risk with investors. And I hate to use a kind of this phraseology, but they basically have to almost charm them to get investments in some of these very, very small diseases. What are some of your thoughts about you know, what that marketplace could look like for this kind of small innovation or emerging innovation that exists in the rare life sciences community if some of these things occur?
Well, I think it's hard to tell other than we know that there will be impact. It's impossible to take this much money out of the system and add this much uncertainty and not have an impact. So we know that there would be impacts. It's, you know, again, not being, you know, coming at it from the patient perspective, it's hard to comment on the financial side of you know, attracting investors and you know, making all of the math work. But we know that there's probably some people on the call now that are working to, you know, raise money for the therapy development that, you know, might be impacting a handful of people, including their own family members. We know that we have, you know, members in Community Congress where they've started a foundation. One woman I'm working with on the orphan drug tax credit advocacy, you know, said she had worked to raise, you know, millions of dollars just to help move forward a therapeutic candidate for her daughter's rare disease. And we know that story happens over and over again because it's in part sometimes the only way it can move forward. So I think it is something, you know, I'm not sure I have an answer in how that type of situation will be affected, but I think it is certainly something that we need to dive in more, you know, and do some interviews, like look at the background of how that money is raised and where that candidate goes after the fact, because, you know, at some point it needs someone to take it to the market and commercialize it. So where along this chain do we have potential for breakdown based on these changes?
Thanks, Jamie.
It's just the recognition that these drugs are not taken by, you know, hundreds of thousands of patients. Not all of these drugs, you know, many of these patients are serving a very small population. And so while it sounds like a great idea to kind of treat everything with a broad brush and the same way, it doesn't work in practice.
And I think to both of your thoughts, you know, as I was working in smaller emerging companies, in these small populations, they're also very hard to find those patients.
Mm-hmm.
We find that there's a lot of undiagnosed patients, underdiagnosed patients, and even when they receive a diagnosis, sometimes there's hesitance to put a patient on therapy. And so as you talk about maybe 200 or 300 patients, it's very challenging to even identify those patients and make sure that they have access to the treatment. You know, one of the patient populations I was working with was about 300 to 400 patients in the US, and they could be identified by a simple test. And yet most patients were diagnosed at age 43 after multiple incidents, multiple interventions, multiple treatment choices, etc. And then finally they get a diagnosis for the disease and can go on therapy. And that was their journey from young adulthood through kind of middle age. And so, you know, those things are very challenging when you're talking about small patient populations. It's even just hard to find those patients.
And Mike, that's why we also focused on the diagnostic side of things, and talk about, a shout out to Congressman Peters for the work that his office has just completed with Congressman Swalwell's office to really reconcile the two ideas around increasing coverage for DNA sequencing services and a standalone bill, as well as compromise language was just introduced as part of Cures 2.0. Which took a lot of work between those two offices, as well as with the advocacy community that we've all been a part of over a number of months, really for the last year or so. And that language is a really great start to helping expand the coverage in the process we're getting coverage for DNA sequencing services. And we thought it was particularly important to keep that language broad and not specific to one technology or another, so that we can really facilitate clinical decision making and the right tests for the right person. And that's, that all was worked out, and what the language proposes is a 15-state pilot program now. And we know, we're not boiling the ocean with this one piece of legislation, but it is a great start, and something that one of our subgroups is addressing, and what else can we do to increase access to diagnostics, because it's sort of a vicious cycle in that, newborn screening, for example, is our best way to diagnose early and find diseases that might otherwise be hidden and causing problems for our kids. But we can't get newborn screening until there's a treatment and a lot of evidence, but we can't get treatments until there's enough patients to test them on. And so, we can't find those patients without newborn screening. And it's kind of a vicious cycle, and something that we know, we need to work on quite closely. And really, one of the ways we're going to do that is try to start quantifying the cost impact of the delayed diagnosis. How do we really identify data that can help move this conversation along?
I think, Jamie, what you talked about there also goes to the kind of not only the costs of the clinical trials in these, very small rare disease populations, but also the logistics, having to create a natural history where there's been no natural history, having to find patients, having to, and then set up the trial sites so that you can get close to those patients. Those are all additional things that might not necessarily go into a product for a larger patient population, that make it very challenging in terms of, we often talk about, patent life, and that being very, very important to a product coming to the market. But in many of these smaller population products, that time to find the patients, to develop the trials that can actually enroll a number of enough patients to actually meet a meaningful endpoint. Those are the types of things that have to go into this. What are your thoughts there in terms of, some of the additional challenges and costs that maybe people aren't thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's why we led in the drug pricing statement with, we must recognize the complexities of developing a treatment for rare disease, because I think there's some education we can do just on that alone, and also, the other arm of our policy efforts in regulatory reform, and what can we build, what infrastructure can we build, that will facilitate, an easier regulatory environment for rare diseases, as well as one of our appropriations priorities was get that full funding for the Office of Orphan Drug Products that can fund some of those efforts in small clinical trials, in natural history studies. And we should be adding more and more to that program. Their authorized amount was $30 million a year, and we were advocating for full funding at that authorized amount, but that's still a drop in the water. It's just they are only able to fund a small fraction of the applications they're getting in every year. And imagine the difference we can make in advancing therapeutic options, if we had that early on in investment, and we had a regulatory environment that really brought all resources to bear in a seamless way for rare.
Yeah, and on a federal level, the word that I keep coming back to is science. I mean, if you're talking about funding and appropriations, You know, my husband works with a rare disease population that he's kind of nurtured and developed this rare disease, and it's all about the funding. And when NIH funding is cut, like the grant lines change and he may or may not be funded. And so, you know, in terms of the initial step of even finding your people, like, can you find your people? Like, you know, something's wrong. And we have the example of, in this case, it started with a 43-year-old male, and he had 2 daughters, and, you know, he knew something was wrong, and it turns out the daughters had something wrong. But then it's like, how, you know, let's find the other people. And so that took NIH funding, that took grant money to find the people. And that's even like, you know, this is like before you can even think about, you know, cures, or at least, you know, helping these people. It's just identifying them. And then you're talking about along the way, I think the other appropriations that need to be made. And so that's when I look at, you know, an oncology drug with 560 patients, it's like, we should be celebrating that. Like the fact that not only have we identified the problem, but now, and if whether it's oncology, whether it's something else, it's like, we should be, you know, making sure that those patients can get that drug, because now not only have we identified what it is, we found them, we should keep nurturing that, not diminishing that innovation.
Thank you. And I think that's really the closing message, is we should be nurturing the innovation and not, you know, doing things that can delay, derail, or, you know, stop the investments that are needed in small populations. So thank you to both of you.